Okay, Jessica Clement is our first speaker of the last session here. Jessica is originally from the Netherlands, but has been spending the last 20 she's been spending the last 20 years or so in Colorado at Colorado State University and Colorado Mountain College in the fields of ecology, natural resources management, and human dimensions. Before, she's worked in several countries in journalism and media-related subjects, and has served as the assistant dean at Colorado Mountain College. As a research associate and now the co-director in the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at CSU, she's in charge of administration of the institution and leads all programs related to ecological and social capacity monitoring, support for place-based collaboration, and science policy disclosures. And with that, please help me welcome Jessica Clement.
So I thought we'd talk about a completely different species now, of the wicked kind. I was trying to be clever and, Halloween wicked, which is... But actually, the word wicked, we're using increasingly, as you're probably very well, we're using increasingly in policy discourses and in social science to describe something pretty real, and I've heard it the whole day in all your sessions. Everything that you work in and what you do, dude, it's wicked. So let's talk about what do we mean by wicked. And I will give you an example from social science in relation to wildlife. And then I'm going to go a little bit more into social science and collaborative learning and what that is and the role that it can play, especially in the cases of restoration. I'll give you a case history in relation to forest restoration and case history in relation to wildlife, just to cover all bases. And then I want to talk a little bit more about collaboration, when it works, what things to think about, and some wicked issues in relation to policy, which gets wicked very quickly, as we know. So this is an article that I always like to use. It's a short article. It was in the Journal of Forestry in 1986. And it has a pretty good description about what we mean by wicked, but it is not the same as complexity. Complexity, we're all pretty good at that. We're well trained in it. We can model it. We can analyze it. We're okay with that. Wickedness is about interrelated issues and problems that are hard to define, and even if you try to define them, everyone's got a different way of defining it. It is also not something that can be addressed with one single formulation. There's not necessarily a stopping rule when you find out when you have found, ta-da, the big solution, because it takes more time than we thought. It's all connected, and it's very difficult to scientifically predict, which is always a total bummer for us scientists. So I would argue that landscape restoration by itself is a wicked proposal, because it does get at all sorts of interconnected questions that are very difficult to define, that involve many different kinds of stakeholders whose values are held very dear, and there's a great deal of uncertainty. And basically, this is what I want to talk about. Restoration, by and large, includes more than ever before this whole subject of uncertainty. And as Fred Provenza was talking about this morning, uncertainty is bad, not good. We want to be able to predict, we want to have the answers, it has to be linear, and that ain't necessarily so. So how do we approach this uncertainty, this wickedness, when we are trying to restore landscapes and populations with stakeholder approval? The thing about uncertainty is also that we've all been trained in statistics, and we, like I said, we like this predictive linearity. And when that doesn't happen, it really means that we have to start using different means to approach issues. And this can be challenging. I think Daryl was talking about the values that we have in our agencies and our institutions, and uncertainty really challenges those values. However, it's just a process. It just takes more time. It can be absorbed in all agencies, I know. Ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed according to the Society of Ecological Restoration. That all by itself, that definition, includes a heck of a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of aspects there that we don't necessarily know. What are we going to restore it back to? How have we measured it? What methods did we use? Etc., etc. Restoration is wicked, and as Daniels and Walker put, I always think this is the understatement of the year, but it's such a nice, kind way of describing wickedness. A truly vexing situations are often rich in systems complexity. Isn't that nice? So, I am director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and there are 3 restoration institutes that were established by Congress in 2004. It's called the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes Act. And our approach is, we are all about restoration. That's our job, is to help agencies and communities and anyone else with this whole subject of forest landscape restoration and reducing wildfire risk. And what we find in Colorado, with the diversity of vegetation types that we're dealing with and demographic changes, is that if a situation is wicked, collaborative learning is really the only way we know of, to be very honest. To be able to create, as one of our stakeholders calls it, a table of trust, where everyone can settle down, understand each other's motivations, and hear the science. Just blimmin' hear it, without immediately hauling out the revolver and being very sure that the scientist is all wrong and can't be trusted. In order to get all that to settle down, we have to create a table of trust, and the only way we know how to do that, and so far it's working fairly well, is collaborative learning. Let me get into the social science a little bit to explore wickedness a little bit more. This is research that I've done on the Pikes and Isabel National Forest, the PSI, the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming, and the Shoshone National Forest. All of this was done in the context of forest planning, and it was values, attitudes, and perceptions research. There was a mapping component associated with it. We asked people what values were important to them. We gave them definitions of these values. And then we asked them on a map to tell us where those values were. So there's a GIS component to this. And I'm afraid I don't have enough time to go into it, but I'm happy to talk with you later. So this is coming out in applied geography. Don't stare yourself blind on this. I'm going to move on very quickly. But the main point is that aesthetic, biodiversity, future, life-sustaining, and recreation values were the highest scoring values on all 3 forests. But if you look at the literature over 40 years all around the country, and Tara Teal, Tara, are you in here somewhere? Okay. She will be here tomorrow, and Tara is going to be presenting far more information on wildlife values. She and Mike Manfred have done really excellent work. But they have used a different way of going about the same question, but they came up with the same results basically. Gradually, the American public is becoming more biocentric in their values. If you ask people what reasons do they favor for uses on a forest, in a forest planning context, again, in red, the higher the number, the more favor. Sport fishing, non-motorized recreation, wildlife viewing and observation, wilderness, fish and wildlife habitat. In other words, anything having to do with wildlife scores very high with the American public. I also had to ask for a couple of things in relation to vegetation treatments, and I just wanted to add this. If you ask people, are you okay with logging on a national forest, and if so, for what reasons? The reasons that they're most comfortable with are protecting life and property, removing dead and insect-infested trees, and create or improving wildlife habitat. If it's for commercial profit only, in Wyoming, folks are more comfortable with it. Culturally, that makes sense. There's a far more greater familiarity with it. But when you look at no support for any logging for any reason, that actually rates the lowest. Now, there's some complexity in this. On the one hand, we see that these fairly biocentric values are rating highest. And by the way, if you think that means translates into a whole bunch of, greenie environmentalists, not really. Think of it. I've had to explain this to a county commissioner in near the Bridger Teton National Forest. And he said, now Jess, this is a mass study you've done, but these values of yours, they look pretty green to me. And I said, yeah, what's the biggest income in your county, Commissioner? Real estate. And I said, why do you think everybody wants to buy a home in your county? Because it's pretty. Aesthetic value translates into very big bucks. So these values are, these are our core values, but it translates into our behaviors, including what we do with our money. But on the other hand, so generally there is this favor for these more biocentric values. On the other hand, there are also a bunch of reasons that people highly favor to do logging in the forest. But therein lies a rub, because the perceptions that people have don't necessarily line up with the science. And the problem is that on the one hand, the favor for doing work in a forest simply to make money, to create profit, that scored fairly low. But on the other hand, everybody does want to see work done on these forests in order, for example, to create wildlife habitat. Well, we need people with the equipment and the skills to be able to do that work. And they have to be able to make a profit in order to put their kids through school, etc., etc. So there's a disconnect there that somehow needs to be addressed. Another one is further down. The wickedness number 2, respondents who score the highest in recreation value, they also scored the highest on economic value. There's a very strong correlation between recreation value and economic value. And in turn, between oil and gas drilling, hunting, and they scored the lowest on fish and wildlife habitat. So there is a bunch of respondents out there, about a third, who favor recreation value, who favor economic value, who favor motorized recreation, who favor hunting, and don't care very much for fish and wildlife habitat. I think there's a bit of wickedness there too. In order to get below this, there is something what we call Q methodology out there. And it's actually, it was designed by William Stevenson, who first got his doctorate at Oxford in England in quantum physics, and then for some insane reason went into social sciences, as you do, and then got a doctorate in social sciences. And he has translated quantum physics in such a way that you can look at discourses. So we use our methodologies, or regression methodologies, in order to look at be able to extrapolate back to a large number of people. But if you want to extrapolate back to this big three-dimensional mass called a discourse of what people are talking about in relation to a subject, and be able to analyze that, something that's fairly nonlinear, full of subjectivity and lots of uncertainty, we can use this Q methodology. And I've used it several times now, and it's been very helpful and very interesting. For example, one of the results on the Bridger Teton National Forest, where I just discovered that second wickedness, for example, is that on the Bridger Teton National Forest, what's actually most important to folks isn't necessarily aesthetics. If you're living in Wyoming near the Bridger Teton National Forest, biodiversity is the most important thing, because from that comes the aesthetic value, because the perception of a forest as beautiful is if it's whole, if it's complete, if everyone's walking around in it. Most species, not wolves. More wickedness. But it's about biodiversity, and biodiversity therefore means hunting, it means fishing, it means identity, it means safety, and it means culture. Our world is round if biodiversity is intact. These Q discourses, what the results of a Q discourse are a number of themes in the discourse. So you find out what are the most prevailing themes that come out of the discourse, and you can also find out what kind of stakeholders load on each theme. This is a very helpful tool, for example, if you're engaged in a collaborative process, because it will tell you what trade-offs need to further be explored. So, for example, a number of you were talking, I think, in Daryl's talk, you were talking about Idaho, I gather, where there's been a discussion with motorized recreationists about hunting, motorized recreation, wildlife. There's a trade-off there, guys. Well, that's the trade-off that I was finding in Wicked issue number 2. That's exactly that thing, that rub. I can find that out through a Q study, and I can tell you, yes, it can be resolved, but you have to find a place and a time to talk with your stakeholders in a more long-term kind of way in order to be able to unravel that trade-off. And it can be done with good success, and it sounds like in Idaho they've been able to do that. A Q study in Leadville, I've also done that. One of the interesting things there is, this is a mining community at 10,000 feet. I've lived there for 12 years, and the forest is sacred. The reason why Leadville is still there and all the mines are closed is because of the forest. And then if you ask people in Leadville, so I suppose it's not okay then to go in and do hard rock mining. Oh no, that's okay. Hard rock mining in the forest is fine, but that gas, that's not okay. No gas. Hard rock mining, just fine. And by the way, if you want to know why there haven't been any forest fires in Leadville, let me tell you, there's not enough oxygen. A lovely elderly lady told me that over tea and biscuits. I was not going to disagree. So collaboration can be a very helpful tool. Social science, of course, is very helpful, but collaboration, I'm sure all of you are involved in it in some way, shape, or form or another. Collaboration, what is it? It occurs when people voluntarily work through their differences and pool their knowledge and resources to achieve goals they could not achieve alone. So the more wicked the situation, the more collaborative learning may be a good tool. What is it about the learning part? These are processes to create common understandings of a situation and develop strategies for collective action to improve the situation. But it's really about creating that common understanding. Because as long as we disagree about what the color is of that cauldron, we're not going to get any further. That's the first base. That's the first place where you have to start. Quick case history, Uncompadre Plateau in Colorado. This is just south of Grand Junction. I'm actually hosting another workshop there in November to talk about exactly this case history. But what we did there, they have a real need to restore ponderosa pine there, but there's very little money. They do have quite the logging infrastructure there, but they need to have something that they can really sell through that mill. What to do? There was disagreement about the science. So they said, okay, let's do the science together. 2 scientists from CSU through CFRI worked with multiple stakeholder groups to collect the science together. So in other words, the data that resulted from it could be trusted by everyone because everyone was part of it. At the same time, a lot of learning happened about what the heck scientists do and what methods they use. There was also debate about what to do in specific places. Ponderosa pine, very quickly, there was not a lot of argument about restoration needed to happen. In the mixed conifer at the higher elevation, major discussion. There's a lot of blue spruce in there. It's very dense. Was it always that way? Does it just need a good fire? What's the deal? So they did these studies and they found out that although there may not be a very strong ecological imperative to do work in the mixed conifer, it would certainly benefit from a wildlife habitat perspective to create more openings. One way to do that was to withdraw the blue spruce. Getting the blue spruce out in turn creates the funding to be able to do the restoration at lower elevation in the ponderosa pine. So because a table of trust was created and because there was science that everyone could agree on, they could agree on these compromises that might not have been possible otherwise. So the project area was 17,000 acres in a 74,000 acre analysis area. So they started off with doing a lot of work together to discover what are the current conditions and what were historic conditions. They did plot diagrams. We put this together in a CFRI report, which you can find on our website. I have actually a few with me. And this resulted in a Forest Service proposed action. From a Forest Service proposed action, in which they proposed to have 6,000 to 8,000 acres of commercial, straight out, commercial timber harvest. We're doing it to make money. That is the management objective, and everyone agreed. Colorado Wild, the fiercest environmental opponent, went to D.C. to help lobby for it. That's how much trust there was. 17,000 to 24,000 cubic feet of commercial timber went to local mills, is going to local mills, and 12,000 to 14,000 acres of prescribed fire was included in this. So this actually is a very interesting Excel spreadsheet that we put together with the multi-party stakeholder group to identify what were going to be the objectives, the treatment objectives, and therefore the variables to measure. And this was the plot diagram that we used to do the ecological monitoring with this multi-stakeholder group. That resulted in the whole process from very beginning through a record of decision took 2 years. That's pretty good for NEPA. No appeals. And right now, as we speak, work is happening on the ground, and we've completed the pre and post monitoring on all sites. So what has this resulted in? Reduce conflict in planning and NEPA costs, create and retain local jobs, reduce unwanted fire and future fire, enhance ecosystem resilience. Model will expand to 74,000 acre area now. Another example, a wildlife example in relation to collaboration. I've had the great privilege of working with Wyoming Game and Fish. And I was invited to come and work with them on something called the Wyoming Range Mule Deer Herd Initiative. Darrell was talking about Wyoming Mule Deer Initiative in a larger context. This is specifically related to the Wyoming Range. It started off with a wicked situation. The perception was that there was not a lot of trust because of things that had happened in the past. There had been a crash in the 90s of the mule deer population, and there were different opinions about why that had happened. Was it the weather? Was it that darn agency? What was it? Whose fault was it? And more importantly, how are we going to move away from that past and move into the future? Internally, there was a lot of discussion about science. They had a lot of scientific resources. They had a lot of data regarding carry capacity. Externally, there were all kinds of different perceptions, including quite a bit of political focus on the whole issue. Then Wyoming Game and Fish had additional wickedness to deal with, including changing demographics, oil and gas, and other extractive uses, as well as a lot of motorized recreation. So they decided to engage in a collaborative learning process, and they started off with I'm kind of seeing it as an outsider. I see it as an internal and external collaboration process. They went full hog into this external collaborative process. They had, so far there have been 4 workshops. There's 4 more going to happen when the draft plan is finalized, when they present it to everyone, and so far it has been hugely well received by the public. A lot of enthusiasm. Then they went into the next phase, which I would call an internal collaboration, because at the end of the day, whatever plan they come up with, everyone with their different opinions within the agency itself also has to be able to support this. So there was a need for internal collaboration as well. So we had all these workshops with the public, and then finally we had one long day of internal collaboration where they meshed a number of different kinds of data. Social science data, their own biophysical data. They had the input that they received. So, in other words, huge success. Let me finish up real quick. Can collaboration work? Yes, but you need all these things, including committed scientists. You too. Policy and wickedness, at the end of the day, the important thing is collaboration can work, it is very helpful, but the sting is it needs to be acknowledged at the top. It needs to be acknowledged in the capitals, including DC. And the last thing that I wanted to end with is social science and collaborative learning, in my opinion, can be very helpful. And that's good, because more wickedness is on its way. There is more complexity on its way, guaranteed. Thanks.
Okay, with that ultra quick wrap up, we do have time for a question or two.
In I don't know if you can, a quick sense, recommend a strategy for developing these collaborations and communications with maybe politically charged projects?
Make sure you have everyone at the table, first of all stakeholders. The people who are making it the most charged, make sure they're at the table. I would do a bit of an assessment in advance just to find out what is the issue at hand exactly, so that you understand all the ins and outs, and especially the trade-offs that are going to come up on the table. And then make sure that you have all the people at the table. And then finally, create a process that everybody can trust. It's all about process. It's not even really about the outcome. It's about the process, because as long as you have a process, and you can use adaptive management, you can use it cyclically, and people will keep coming to the table.
Thank you.